Versailles Palace of Tsar Nicholas II is the setting for Russia's welcome. The conference is to seal Hitler's fate and establish lasting peace. Hitler's hordes were being crushed between the jaws of Allied might. His people were in disordered flight. His remaining Axis partner, Japan, was being pounded by terrific air blows. This meeting crystallizes the Allied resolve that Germany shall be beaten unconditionally and that lasting peace shall prevail throughout the world.
The unity presented by the newsreels was an accurate reflection of the mood at Yalta. The Allies agreed on the division and control of post-war Germany and on the creation of the United Nations to secure the peace. But the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that he now carried far less clout than the American and Soviet leaders, Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. The Second World War had created two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain was no longer in the same league. American newsreels spelt out the need for the United States to play a new role.
The lessons of history were learned in this century slowly, expensively, bloodily. Twice war swept across Europe. Twice non-interventionist America was forced to intervene. In 1914, Germany went to war against the Allies. Less than 3 years later, America had to spend the lives of her men and the wealth of her land to help end that war. After the 1918 armistice, a League of Nations was established to keep the peace. But American policies of that time kept the United States out, and lacking authority, the League could not prevent the outbreak of World War II. As totalitarian conquests mounted, America was forced to give up the neutrality principle of an earlier century when oceans were barriers and wars were not global.
But during the Second World War, while it was fighting for democracy, the United States had been allied to a dictator. Though perhaps less monstrous than Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin was a brutal despot who had sent millions of Soviet citizens to concentration camps. The wartime newsreels said nothing of these atrocities. Instead, they encouraged American admiration for the Soviet war effort, which helped to foster a misleading image of Stalin as good old Uncle Joe. All the American newsreels used in this program are in their original form, but the inaccessibility of Russian material means that some Soviet newsreels have been compiled from various film sources and the Soviet press.
The peoples of the great Soviet state have won the right to be respected as one of the great powers in the world. The glorious Red Army advancing on the German fascist beast saved the world from the bloodthirsty Hitlerite regime. The German army invaded our Soviet motherland, destroying everything in its path and reaching the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941. Only the superhuman efforts by the Soviet people forced them to retreat. As the Red Army drove them back across Soviet soil, the horrifying scale of the Nazi atrocities was discovered. The victorious, liberating Red Army, led by the genius of its great leader and commander, Comrade Stalin, completely cleared the German invaders from the soil of the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and a considerable part of Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The Yalta Conference. At Yalta, the three great allies discussed the question of Poland and affirmed their common desire to see the establishment of a strong, free, independent, and democratic Poland.
Throughout history, Poland has been the corridor through which the enemy has passed into Russia. Twice in the last 30 years, our enemies, the Germans, have passed through this corridor. Poland is not only a question of honor, but of life and death for the Soviet Union.
The West was quite willing for Poland, like much else of Eastern Europe, to become a Soviet sphere of influence. But it also wanted Poland to have a government of its own choosing. The problem was that no democratically elected government in Poland would be acceptable to Stalin. So in Poland, as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union set out to impose communist-dominated regimes, a process which was bound to cause conflict with the West.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland. years full of suffering and death and sacrifice. Now the war against Germany is won.
Americans celebrated victory in a country that had not been occupied or bombed during the war. The American way of life shone like a beacon of fabulous prosperity. The Soviet Union paid a terrible price for victory. 20 million people were killed. The country near to economic ruin. Thousands of towns and villages were completely destroyed. Food, clothing, housing were all severely rationed. A tremendous labor of reconstruction faced the nation.
Full story behind the Potsdam Conference, meetings which became decisive action, as Attlee and Truman got Stalin's reassurance that the promise made at Yalta would be kept. Russia, Stalin had said, would enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat. It was 3 months to the day when she did.
Behind the smiles for the cameras, relations between the Allies at Potsdam were much cooler than they had been at Yalta. Attlee had replaced Churchill, and on Roosevelt's death in April, Truman had become US president. Unlike his predecessor, he was suspicious of Stalin. At Potsdam, Truman announced that the Americans had successfully tested the first atomic bomb. Western's secrecy about the bomb strengthened Stalin's distrust. Soviet newsreels began to adopt a more hostile tone.
One of the greatest crimes against mankind was committed for the sake of political pressure. President Truman took it lightly, as though he was playing with a baseball and not an atomic bomb.
Which has been heralded as a major declaration of American foreign policy. 1 million people are gathered to hear President Truman.
We must find the answer to the problems created by the release of atomic energy. The possession in our hands of this new power of destruction we regard as a sacred trust. We shall refuse to recognize any government imposed upon any nation by the force of any foreign power.
The single threat which the Soviet Union feared most from the West was the American atomic bomb. After the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945, Stalin declared privately, "The balance of power has been destroyed." It was another 4 years before Russia had an atomic bomb of its own. Russia's armed forces, however, dwarfed those of her wartime allies. Just as the Soviet Union feared the West's atomic weapons, so the West feared the huge Red Army in Europe.